Yeah.
I have read, and you could probably confirm more because I know you're way more well read on all this than I am. The reason why African slaves were even brought in is because the white slaves were dying. No, they're not slaves, but the white indentured servants were dying because of malaria in the South, and they had a really, really tough time of it. So they went to Africa where there was a degree of ability to fight the disease, if you will. Have you ever heard any of that, or no?
Yeah. No,
And I'm not excusing it. I'm
no,
just
that's
it's
roughly correct. Of course. So just to say the obvious, because we were both reasonably prominent at this point, and people, watch this stuff with the intent of criticizing. I mean, obviously, neither of us is excusing slavery. Slavery is bad. Don't you agree, Eric? Like slavery.
absolutely.
That's right. In general, feudalism is a bad, ineffective system. Now you could ask. Obviously, you don't want slaves, but you could ask: is there another way of organizing some of these historical countries? When you get into Russia or Mali over in the Black Lands, given the level of technology that's available, do you have an option other than barons or telestai or whatever you decide to call them? And the answer might be probably not. But under modern conditions, yeah, sure, feudalism is bad, slavery is bad, but that's not really the point. The point is there a specific, unique evil to what we engaged in the West, or were blacks captured because of something? Some inherent genetic weakness on the part of either blacks or whites or anything like that? And the answer is, of course not. No. Slavery is something that's endured across virtually all human societies. So what you had in the USA first was people that are sometimes called slavees, sometimes called 23 years, most commonly just called indentured servants. But you would bring in people from Scotland or Ireland or whatever. I mean, the poorer parts of the British Isles. You've seen Braveheart. They were pretty poor. The potato famine had occurred around this time. And these people would commit to, in exchange for being brought to a country where there might be food and work, would commit to working for you for a long period. I mean, 7 years was at the lower end, 14, 23 were very common. Bear in mind, people at this time lived to be about 30. So this was actually a fairly effective quasi-slave system. It's technically accurate to say things like, well, Irishmen were never slaves in the USA. Correct. They were indentured servants who couldn't leave Massa's farm for 23 years. It is a subtle distinction, but it is a distinction. Your kids would probably be free. Like, I get it. But if you're the actual guy out there picking cotton, getting hit with a whip, it probably feels pretty technical to you. Anyway, the problem with this is that those people, I don't know to what extent this is genetic as versus cultural training. I think there's a lot of pseudoscience around race. But I mean, those people came from a colder climate. There were different diseases. So both white and native non-slaves tended to die pretty rapidly under these conditions of Southern plantation agriculture. And there was a shift toward black slaves. And there are two variables there. One is that African Americans, frankly, come from a climate in West Africa that's pretty similar to what you got in the deep South in Latin America. I mean, it's deeply creepy to us to think about selecting like your slaves for the sort of property you have. So you might have, white men in the North and so on. But this is what you would do if you were, the baron. You were one of these large corrupt landowners. That's one reason for the advent of black slavery. There are two reasons why Africa became a focal area for slaves. One is that, considering where the slaves were going to. The other
too.
I'm sorry?
A lot of supply too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, a lot of people, there were a lot of wars at that time. Africa was perhaps a few hundred years behind in terms of technological development. So not like a land of kings, as Hotep's claim, also not, rock-throwing savages, as you sometimes hear on the far right. But maybe if you're looking at Ashanti sort of at a high medieval level of development by the time the whites had gotten around to steamboats and so on, mainly due to isolation. So you had kingdoms that were expanding inland at the time that the Caucasian and Arab countries needed a supply of slaves. So the African kings were more than willing to sell these slaves. This, again, is something that's absolutely uncontested in history. I mean,
that's their enemy. I mean, it's a convenient way to get rid of an enemy. I mean, it's wasteful to kill them if you could just make them go away.
Yep. In an absolutely horrible sense that we are not endorsing, slavery is a step up from what existed prior to slavery, which was genocide. So if you were a conqueror in the sort of pre-Roman era, if you defeated another tribe, there was no use for the males. I mean, generally, you'd give them sort of a chance to die with honor. Everyone would lean their head over the block and you'd chop it off with an axe or something like that. It wasn't necessarily very brutal, but there was no use for spare men. There was, unless you're going to quote unquote geld them, which is a disgusting process a lot of people didn't want to engage in. You can't have a bunch of unfree males standing around with axes and hoes and other potential weapons in their hands. So they were just killed. It was only when large scale estate agriculture became possible with that entire system of overseers and so on, or at least some laws regulating slavery, that men who had survived a battle were kept alive at all. Women, I assume for various other reasons, were often allowed to live. So, I mean, in Viking society, you had the captured, quote unquote, English brides and all that. But slavery evolved out of the previous practice, which in many cases across all races was killing and eating your enemies. So it's very easy to criticize that's barbarism, so on. But you're criticizing a particular point all along the trajectory of history. Like, rather than enslaving opponents, would you prefer that, the historical kings or the black ones in Africa just killed them all? Anyway, that's one of the reasons so many black African slaves came to the USA, the expansion of African empires and the quote unquote suitability of people to that climate. Another reason is just that there was more weakly organized land in Africa. This was even more true in Eastern Europe, by the way. But like, if you're a slave raider, you wouldn't want to go to a strong organized country, say France, and try to snatch people at random, because you'd very rapidly find that first the Gendarmerie and then the French army were chasing you down to the docks, because this is a country. Even by the 1800s, there'd be signal fires warning the king's troops. And I mean, there'd be people using tools like writing and fast ships to get the word out. So slavers tended to go to areas where there was sort of weak local control. And a lot of that was the case in Central Africa. Again, that was also the case in Eastern Europe, those chaotic countries that became today's Bosnia and Czechia and so on. I mean,
aren't we seeing it now? I mean, Libya became a failed state and they have open slave markets now. So
yeah,
isn't that also a modern representation of, hey, this is what happens when everything falls apart? We get primitive, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, it's worth noting that's an interesting example, again, of what we talked earlier about, which is sort of media blind spotting. So, like, yeah, there are large open slave markets on the Libyan coast. And I mean, I guess in our terms, most of the slavers would be Arabic and more than a few would be black. So, I mean, it's one of those awkward sorts of realities. I mean, it's the slavery that's occurring in public is being conducted entirely by people of color, quote unquote. And most of the people being sold in the markets are probably people of color, although I wouldn't want to be shipwrecked immediately off that part of the coast. But, you have to feel there'd be a little more attention if, for example, blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people were either running the market and selling blacks or were being sold as slaves themselves by the Arabs. I mean, I think we would have, in either of those cases, probably intervened already. But this is one of those ambiguous situations where we might view it as our enemies selling our other enemies or something like that, given our relationship with both North and Central Africa. We don't do anything. But yeah, where you have nation state collapse, you almost immediately see the resurgence of both slavery and feudalism. I would assume that there are very similar practices going on in parts of Afghanistan, in some of the war-torn African countries, Congo in the recent past, so on down the line. Yeah, civilization is a thin veneer over animalistic barbarism for humans, no matter what they look like.